What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon video. In this video, I want to look ahead at Season 3 of House of the Dragon and what should be one of the most shocking moments in the show. They've already set the stage by heavily foreshadowing this horrific event throughout most of the second season. We are about to see why a man known as the Shepherd stands out as one of the most dangerous and influential figures in Westeros during this incredibly dark moment in House Targaryen's unstable history. Although he may not be as immediately recognizable as the other major figures in House of the Dragon, the Shepherd's influence drastically alters the Dance of the Dragons, landing him at the center of one of the most infamous moments in Westerosi history. Now, if you haven't read Fire and Blood, some of you may be wondering how some random homeless-looking man could have such an effect on the Targaryen Civil War. Well, as you all know, the Dance of the Dragons left the city of King's Landing very unstable. House Valerion's blockade in the Narrow Sea led to a widespread hunger throughout the city. It's no secret the small folk were living in fear. Most of them wanted to get the hell out of that city because they knew it was only a matter of time before they either starved or died from the dragons raining down fire from the sky. And all of their feelings were amplified after the gates were shut, locking them inside the city. Now, believe it or not, they did already introduce the Shepherd right before Helaena and Alicent were surrounded by the small folk during one of the riots in the second season. In that scene, the Shepherd reaches out for Alicent, but a member of the Kingsguard immediately severs his hand from his arm. I have to imagine that moment is only going to further enrage a man who is already disillusioned with the Targaryen dynasty. Now, according to the World of Ice and Fire, it was the fear of the dragons that gave birth to the Shepherd. Unfortunately, we cannot say who he was, as his name was lost to history. Now, whoever he was, he began to deliver his message in the Cobbler's Square, saying the dragons were demons, the spawn of godless Valyria, and the doom of men. And the small folk began to listen. Night after night, there were hundreds and then thousands. Their fear soon became anger, and that anger would eventually transform into a thirst for blood. Everything came to a head near the end of the Dance of the Dragons after Rhaenyra sat on the Iron Throne. As soon as they realized Rhaenyra would not save them, the small folk started looking at the Shepherd as their salvation. The small folk, who were exhausted by taxes, famine, and oppression, began to rally around his message. He would eventually become a symbol of the masses' desire for justice and equality. As you can imagine, the Shepherd's rise coincided with the unrest and instability in the city. His goal was not to only overthrow the dragons, but to also establish a new social order. While his ideas were seen as irrational by many, they resonated deeply with those who were suffering under the Targaryen dynasty. And as Rhaenyra sat on the Iron Throne, safely behind the castle walls, the streets below her became filled with rage. Once again, the Shepherd began to deliver his message. Then he raised his right arm and jabbed the stump of his missing hand at Rhaenys Hill behind him, at the dragon pit black against the stars. He went on to say the demons live up there. Fire and blood, blood and fire. This is their city. If you would make it yours, first you must kill them. Thousands of shouts erupted, "Kill them! Kill them!" And like some animal with 1,000 legs, the Shepherd's lambs began to make their way to the dragon pit. Most of them had swords and knives in hand. Now, some of them did slip away and go back home. However, for every man who did leave, there were 3 more who joined the Dragon Slayers. And when they finally reached the dragons, their numbers had more than doubled. Now, across the city, high atop Aegon's Hill, Mushroom watched the attack unfold from the roof of Maegor's Holdfast with Rhaenyra, her son, and members of her court. Now, as soon as word had reached her that the Shepherd's savage flock was on the march, Rhaenyra sent riders to the gates, commanding them to seize the Shepherd, stop his followers, and defend the royal dragons. Now that madness fell on the city, Rhaenyra wasn't sure if her riders would survive the mission. Rhaenyra's youngest son Joffrey begged his mother to let him ride with the knights, but she said no. "We're gonna need every sword here to defend the castle." "They're gonna kill the dragons," Joffrey said dreadfully. "Or the dragons will kill them," his mother said. "Let them burn. The realm will not long miss them." "Mother, what if they kill my dragon?" Joffrey said. Rhaenyra did not believe it. "They are vermin. They're all drunks and fools and gutter rats. They'll run as soon as they see the dragon flame." Now, Mushroom, on the other hand, was not so ready to underestimate the small folk so easily. He said they might be drunks, but a drunken man knows not fear. And they might be fools, but a fool can kill a king. And 1,000 rats can bring down a bear. I saw it happen once down in Flea Bottom. It was only when the watchers on the roof heard Syrax that Joffrey's absence was noted. It was already too late. "No," Rhaenyra was heard to say, "I forbid it. I forbid it." But even as she said the words, her dragon flapped up from the yard. launching herself into the night sky with little Joffrey desperately holding onto her back with a sword in hand. "Go after him," Rhaenyra shouted. "All of you, every man, every boy." Now 7 men did ride from the Red Keep that night into the madness of the city. Grand Maester Munkin said they were men of honor, duty-bound to obey Rhaenyra's commands. Now Mushroom would name them dolts and dastards, eager for some reward, and too dumb to believe they might die. Honestly, all 3 of them might be right. Many of the singers had made songs of the Ride of the Seven, and many stories have been told about the doom they faced as they fought their way across the city while King's Landing burned around them, and the alleys of Flea Bottom ran red with blood. We've heard about Joffrey's last flight as well, while he was on the back of his mother's dragon, Syrax. Now, we don't fully understand the bond a dragon has with its rider. Wiser heads have thought about that mystery for centuries. We do know, however, that dragons are not horses to be ridden by any man who throws a saddle on their back. Syrax was Rhaenyra's dragon. She had never known another rider. Although Joffrey was known to her by sight and scent, the great yellow dragon did not want him on her back. In his haste to be away before he could be stopped, Joffrey had vaulted onto Syrax without strapping into the saddle. We can only assume he wanted to either fly Syrax into battle, or more likely to cross the city to the dragon pit to get his own dragon. Mayhaps he even meant to lose the other dragons as well, before the mob of the shepherd's followers slaughtered them. Unfortunately, Joffrey never made it to the Hill of Rhaenys. As soon as he made it into the air, Syrax started bucking beneath him, fighting to be free of this unfamiliar rider. And from down below, stones and arrows flew at him from the hands of the shepherd's blood-soaked lambs, only making the dragon even madder. Hundreds of feet above Flea Bottom, Joffrey slid from the dragon's back and fell to the earth. He crashed first into the roof before rolling off to fall another 40 feet amidst a shower of broken tiles. We are told that the fall broke his back, that shards of slate rained down from him like knives, and that his own sword went right through his belly. In Flea Bottom, men still speak of the candlemaker's daughter named Robin who held the broken boy in her arms and gave him comfort as he died. Now, according to some of those who were there, Joffrey's last words were "Mother, forgive me," though men still argue whether he was speaking of his own mother Rhaenyra, or if he was praying to the mother above. Thus died Joffrey Velaryon, the Prince of Dragonstone, and the heir to the Iron Throne, the last of Rhaenyra's sons by Laenor Velaryon, or the last of the bastards by Sir Harwin, depending on which one you choose to believe. It did not take long before the shepherd's flock fell onto Joffrey's dead body. They immediately ripped off his boots from his feet and the sword from his belly, then stripped him of his fine blood-stained clothes. There were others who were more savage, who began ripping at his body. It said that both his hands were cut off, so that the scum of the street might claim the rings on his fingers. Joffrey's right foot was also hacked through at the ankle, and the butcher's apprentice was sawing at his neck to claim his head when the 7 who rode came thundering down on them. There amidst the foul odor of Flea Bottom, a battle was held in the mud and blood for Joffrey's body. They were finally able to grab the boy's body, except for his missing foot, though 3 of the 7 fell in the fighting. And even as the blood flowed in the alleys of Flea Bottom, another battle began around the dragon pit above, atop the Hill of Rhaenys. Now, the dragon pit did have its own guards known as the Dragon Keepers, but those men were only 7 and 70 in number, and fewer than 50 had the watch that night. There wasn't enough of them to stop the shepherd's angry flock of madmen. Although their swords drank deep of the blood of their attackers, the numbers were against them. And after the shepherd's lambs smashed through the doors, the Dragon Keepers were overwhelmed and soon slaughtered. Mayhaps the attackers hoped to take the dragons down while they were asleep, but the sound of battle made that damn near impossible. Now, those who did live to tell the story afterwards speak of shouts and screams, and the smell of fire and blood in the air. There were 4 dragons within the dragon pit that night. By the time the first of the attackers came running into the sand, all 4 of the dragons were awake and angry. Now, for every man who died, nearly a dozen more suffered burns and yet survived. Stuck within the dragon pit, hemmed in by the walls and the dome and bound by heavy chains, the dragons could not fly away, or evade the attacks from their foes. Instead of dropping out of the sky to unleash their flames, the dragons had to find another way to fight back. The dragon pit was transformed into a fiery hell where burned men staggered screaming through the smoke, and their flesh falling off blackened bones. And yet again, for every man who died, nearly a dozen more would rise up to fight again. They were heard shouting the dragons must needs die, and one by one, they did. Now Shrykos was the first dragon to die, slain by the woodsman known as Hob the Hewer. It said that he jumped onto her neck, driving his axe down into the dragon's head. 7 blows did Hob deliver while his legs were locked around the dragon's neck, and each time his axe fell, he shouted one of the names of the 7. It was the seventh blow, the stranger's blow, that slew the dragon, smashing through scale and bones into the dragon's brain. A man known as the Burning Knight delivered the next fatal blow to the second dragon, Morgul. It is said that he ran headlong into the dragon's flame with his weapon in hand, thrusting it into the dragon's eye as the dragon flame melted the steel armor that encased him and devoured the flesh within. Joffrey's dragon Tyraxes slid back into its lair, roasting so many would-be dragon slayers as they rushed in after him. It would not be long before the entrance to its lair was blocked off by a stack of dead bodies. It was the shepherd himself who directed his followers to break through the back door. As the dragon began to turn, his chains fouled, entangling him in a web of steel that fatally limited his movement. Half a dozen men would later claim to have dealt the fatal blow. Now, the last of the 4 dragons did not die so easily. Legend has it that Dreamfire had broken free of 2 of her chains after Helena's death. As others closed about her, she took flight, circling the cavernous interior of the dragon pit and swooping down to attack the men below. The other dragons were able to kill a lot of men before they died, however Dreamfire slew more than all 3 of them combined. Hundreds of them fled in fear of her flames, but hundreds more led the attack. Even as Dreamfire flew to the top of the dome, the dragon was within easy reach of archer and crossbowmen, and their arrows flew wherever she went. Unable to flee, Dreamfire attacked, savaging her foes until the sands of the dragon pit floor was soaked in blood. Unfortunately, the end finally came after one of the crossbow bolts nicked the dragon's eyes. Half blind and maddened by a dozen lesser injuries, Dreamfire spread her wings and flew straight up at the great dome above in a last desperate attempt to break free. Already weakened by the dragon flame, the dome cracked under the force of impact, and a moment later half of it came falling down, crushing both the dragon and its slayers under tons of broken stone and rubble. The storming of the dragon pit was done. 4 of the Targaryen dragons lay dead, yet the shepherd was not victorious, for Rhaenyra's own dragon remained alive and free. And as his burned and broken followers came stumbling out of the dragon pit, Syrax descended on them from the sky. 1,000 shrieks and shouts echoed across the city. Atop the hill of Rhaenys, the dragon pit wore a crown of yellow fire, burning so bright it seemed as if the sun was rising. Now many of the queen's companions on the rooftop fled, fearing the fires would soon engulf the entire city, even the Red Keep atop Aegon's high hill. Rhaenyra herself wrapped her arms about her last living son, Aegon the Younger, holding him fiercely against her own body, and she would not release him until that dreadful moment when Syrax fell from the sky. Unchained and riderless, Syrax might have easily flown away from the madness. The sky was hers after all. She could have went back to the Red Keep, left the city entirely, or taken flight to Dragonstone. No one knows why she stayed. Was it the sound of the fire that made her go to the Hill of Rhaenys, the screams of the dying dragons, or the smells of burning flesh? We cannot know. No more than we can know why Syrax descended on the shepherd's flock, devouring dozens instantly, when she might have easily have rained fire on them from above, for in the sky no man could have stopped her. We can only account for what actually happened as Mushroom, the Septon, and Grand Maester Munkin have set it down for us. As you can imagine, there were a lot of different stories about how or why Syrax died that night. Grand Maester Munkin said Hop the Hewer delivered the fatal blow with his axe, though this is almost certainly mistaken. Is it likely that the same man could have slain 2 dragons on the same night and in the same manner? Others say Syrax was killed by a blood-soaked giant who leapt from the dragon pit's broken dome onto the dragon's back. Even a crossbowman named Bean would claim the kill afterward, bragging about it in many taverns and inns, until one of Rhaenyra's supporters became tired of his nonsense and had his tongue cut out. Maybe all of these men helped slay the dragon, but the story that's most often heard in King's Landing named the shepherd himself as the Dragon Slayer. As others fled, the story went, the one-handed shepherd stood fearless and alone against the angry dragon. In his hand was a black blade made of smoke that turned to steel as he swung it, slicing off the head of Syrax from her body. And so the story was told, even by the Septon in his account of these dark days, and so the singer sang for many years thereafter. When it was all said and done, King's Landing was lost, everyone agreed, and Rhaenyra must needs to abandon the city. Reluctantly, her grace did leave the next day. After the Iron Throne was left vacant, the capital of Westeros was up for grabs. The shepherd himself never claimed kingship, for he styled himself as a son of the Seven. Yet it cannot be denied that he held influence over the tens of thousands from the smoking rubble of the dragon pit. Now, the heads of the 5 dragons that his followers had slain had been set up on spikes, and every night the shepherd would stand beside them and share his word. Now that the dragons were dead, the shepherd set his sights on the highborn and the wealthy. In the early days after Rhaenyra had fled from the city, the shepherd was by far the most powerful man in King's Landing, but as the nights went by, the number of his followers slowly became smaller and smaller. Now, the small folk of the city was said to have basically awakened from what felt like a bad dream. The madness that had fallen over them eventually faded away, leaving them to live with the shame of what they had done on that fateful evening. The shepherd and his followers essentially overwhelmed the city, leading to the death of Rhaenyra's son Joffrey, as well as the slaughter of 5 of House Targaryen's dragons. The balance had shifted back into the Green's favor. As you can see, the shepherd was able to capitalize on the widespread suffering and disillusionment of the small folk. The Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons, had devastated and even destabilized most of Westeros, resulting in a lack of food, the destruction of land, and an overall hardship for the small folk. The shepherd was able to harness their fear and misery as his own weapon that would strike back against House Targaryen's dragons. Although he may look like a random homeless man, he was able to organize a mass following and even lead an uprising against King's Landing because his flock saw him as a religious figure who could bring them justice and salvation. And the storming of the Dragon Pit will always be remembered as one of the darkest days in Westerosi history. This is why I believe he was arguably one of the most dangerous and influential men in Westeros during the Dance of the Dragons.